On the 13th of March, 1881, a bomb exploded on the streets of St. Petersburg. Tsar Alexander II was dead. Within hours, a rumour spread across the Russian Empire with the speed and precision of a weapon. The Jews had done it. The accusation was false. The assassins belonged to a Russian revolutionary group called Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, and had no connection whatsoever to Jewish communities. But the truth was irrelevant. What followed was one of the most systematically violent episodes of organised persecution in 19th century Europe. Within weeks, impoverished Jewish communities across southern Russia were attacked by mobs. Synagogues were burned, homes were destroyed. In 1881 alone, pogroms were recorded in 166 Russian towns and cities. The violence was not spontaneous. Local authorities stood aside or actively participated. Women were assaulted. Children watched their homes reduced to ash. The question that would define the following 3 decades for millions of people was not whether to leave. It was whether leaving was even possible, and if so, where on earth was safe enough to go. The answers to those questions would permanently alter the population, culture, industry and politics of the United Kingdom. But in the spring of 1881, none of that was yet visible. All that was visible was fire. May laws confined Jews to the Pale of Settlement. The violence of the pogroms alone might have been survivable. Terrible, but survivable. What followed them was something more calculated and more suffocating. In May of 1882, the Russian government issued a series of emergency regulations that would become known as the May Laws. These measures prohibited Jews from settling in rural villages, even within the already restricted territory where they were legally permitted to live. Jewish children faced strict quotas in schools and universities. Jewish professionals were barred from entire sectors of the economy. Jews were forbidden from trading on Sundays or Christian holidays. The Pale of Settlement, a designated zone of territory along Russia's western frontier covering parts of present-day Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, became, in effect, a vast cage. Approximately 5 million Jews were compressed into this territory, competing for survival on plots of land too small and in trades too crowded to sustain them. In Romania and Austria-Hungary, conditions were similarly oppressive, with government-sanctioned discrimination pushing Jewish communities into poverty and legal vulnerability. By the early 1880s, the combined pressure of physical violence, legal exclusion, and economic strangulation had created a population with no viable future where they stood. More than a third of Russia's Jewish population would leave the country in the 4 decades that followed. Their departure was not a choice. It was an act of survival. Railways make mass emigration suddenly possible and affordable. For centuries, the Jews of Eastern Europe had endured persecution without the means to escape it on any meaningful scale. What changed in the 1880s was not only the intensity of the violence, but the existence, for the first time in history, of the infrastructure to leave. The expansion of the railway network across Central and Eastern Europe transformed the geography of emigration entirely. In the middle decades of the 19th century, the journey from a village in the Russian Pale of Settlement to a North Sea port took several months and required resources that most families simply did not possess. By 1880, that same journey had been reduced to a matter of days, and the cost had fallen to levels that a working family could reach by selling household possessions. The great ocean liners that entered service after 1880 crossed the Atlantic in under a week. Steamships crossing the North Sea from Hamburg or Bremen to the ports of Hull and Grimsby made the route to England faster still. Shipping companies, recognizing the commercial opportunity, actively recruited passengers in the towns and villages of the Pale. Their agents distributed printed leaflets describing England and America in terms designed to appeal to desperate people. The combination of accessible transport, aggressive commercial marketing, and the growing network of letters sent home by earlier emigrants created what historians would later describe as chain migration, community following community, village following village, westward across Europe. Families flee westward carrying only what they could. The departure scenes from the villages and small towns of the Pale of Settlement were recorded by journalists, charity workers, and government inspectors throughout the 1880s and 1890s. They described the same image repeated across hundreds of communities. Families standing at railway stations with bundles of clothing, tools of their trade, and whatever documents they had managed to preserve. Furniture, books, ritual objects, and accumulated possessions of generations were left behind or sold for a fraction of their value. Many families had spent months saving the cost of a steerage ticket. The journey itself moved in stages. From the villages of Poland, Lithuania, or the Ukraine, families travelled by rail to the major transit cities, Warsaw, Vilna, Brody, and from there west to the German ports of Hamburg and Bremen, or north to the Baltic. At each stage, the travellers encountered officials, inspectors, currency exchangers, and agents of varying degrees of honesty. Those who could not prove they had sufficient funds to support themselves risked being turned back at the border. The crossing from Hamburg or Bremen to Hull or Grimsby typically took between 36 and 48 hours. Most passengers travelled in steerage, the lowest decks with minimal light and ventilation, crowded with other families in identical circumstances. By the time they reached the English coast, many had been travelling continuously for 2 weeks or more. Ships crossed the North Sea towards Hull's docks. Hull, on the eastern coast of Yorkshire, was for several decades the primary point of entry for Eastern European Jewish immigrants arriving in Britain. The ships that docked there came primarily from Hamburg and Bremen, and they carried passengers who were, in many cases, already at the limits of their physical and financial endurance. The port authorities at Hull processed thousands of arrivals throughout the 1880s and 1890s. Many of these immigrants had intended to continue to North America. Britain was, for a significant number, a transit point rather than a final destination. But the cost of the transatlantic crossing placed America beyond reach for the most impoverished, and so England became not a stepping stone but a terminus. From Hull, those continuing south travelled by train to London, arriving at Liverpool Street Station in the East End, a deliberate choice by the railway companies, who routed immigrant trains to this terminus precisely because it was closest to Whitechapel, where established Jewish communities already existed. Others disembarked at Grimsby, or made their way to Leeds and Manchester, where the woolen and textile industries offered immediate prospects for employment. By 1885, a recognisable pattern of settlement had established itself, a concentration in the East End of London, a secondary concentration in the Leylands district of Leeds, and a third in the Strangeways and Cheetham districts of Manchester. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming content about the United Kingdom and its history. Thank you for your support, and now, let's continue. Thousands pour into Whitechapel's already overcrowded streets. Whitechapel in the 1880s was already one of the most densely populated districts in the world. The arrival of tens of thousands of Eastern European Jewish immigrants within a single decade compressed it further, beyond any reasonable measure of habitability. The district of Spitalfields, which bordered Whitechapel to the north, had been absorbing immigrant communities for 2 centuries. French Huguenots in the 17th century, Irish workers in the early 19th, and it now absorbed another. The streets around Petticoat Lane, Commercial Road, Brick Lane and Goulston Street became the centre of a community that was, by 1888, between 45,000 and 50,000 strong. By 1900, the Jewish population of the East End of London exceeded 135,000. The density of settlement was extraordinary. In the area around Whitechapel, the population reached 227 persons per acre, the highest figure recorded anywhere in the East End. Families occupied single rooms in buildings originally designed for storage or light industry. Cellars were rented as living quarters. In 1884, the United Synagogue reported formally on the state of housing in the East End, a report that led directly to the founding of 2 private social housing companies, including the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company, chaired by Nathan Rothschild, which provided housing at a modest return for investors while improving conditions for residents. Sweatshop workshops exploit desperate workers for 18 hours. The economic life of Whitechapel in the 1880s and 1890s was dominated by a single industry, and that industry was built on a system that contemporaries described, without euphemism, as sweating. The garment trade employed up to 70% of the East End's immigrant workforce. It operated through a network of small workshops, often no larger than a domestic room, where traditional tailoring processes had been fragmented into low-skilled or semi-skilled tasks, each performed by a single worker. The hours were brutal. Cobblers and tailors worked 16 to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, in rooms with poor ventilation, inadequate light, and no sanitary facilities worth the name. Wages were paid per piece rather than per hour, which meant that income fluctuated with the rhythms of trade and rewarded speed over everything else. In 1889, researchers working for the social reformer Charles Booth counted 571 workshops producing men's coats alone in less than 1 square mile around Whitechapel. The workers in these shops were largely excluded from the mainstream British trade union movement, which viewed Jewish immigrants as a threat to wage levels rather than as potential members. In response, Jewish workers began organising themselves. A variety of Jewish trade unions emerged in the late 19th century, including the Hebrew Cabinet Makers Society, the International Furriers Society, and the Tailors and Pressers Union. In Manchester, the Jewish Machinists, Tailors and Pressers Trade Union, founded in 1889, organised a successful strike of 1,500 workers the following year. Anti-Jewish riots erupt across England and Wales. The arrival of more than 100,000 Eastern European Jews into Britain between 1880 and 1900 did not pass without organised opposition. The response from sections of the British press, the trade union movement, and the political establishment ranged from hostility to outright violence. Ben Tillett, a prominent trade union leader, publicly described Jewish immigrants as the dregs and scum of the continent who made overcrowded slums more fetid, putrid, and congested. Newspapers in the East End ran regular campaigns portraying Jewish workers as wage undercutters who threatened the livelihoods of English workers. The charge had some economic basis. Desperate immigrants did accept lower wages and longer hours than established workers, but it was systematically amplified by prejudice that preceded the immigration wave entirely. In South Wales, anti-Jewish violence erupted openly in 1902 and 1903, with Jewish businesses attacked and residents assaulted in the streets. In the East End, the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888 generated immediate and intense suspicion directed at the Jewish community. Sir Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, went on record stating that the murderer was a low-born Polish Jew living in the heart of Whitechapel, a claim with no evidential basis that reflected the ambient prejudice of the period. In 1901, Sir William Evans Gordon, Conservative Member of Parliament for Stepney, founded the British Brothers League, which recruited between 10,000 and 12,000 members around a single demand: stop Jewish immigration. Parliament passes Britain's first ever immigration control law. The political pressure generated by the British Brothers League, the Conservative Party, and sections of the press produced in 1905 a piece of legislation that marked a fundamental turning point in British history. The Aliens Act of 1905 was the first law in the history of the United Kingdom to formally control immigration. Before it passed, the position was, in the words of the Liberal Prime Minister Lord Rosebery in 1894, entirely open. Any foreigner, whatever his nation or political creed, could find in Britain a safe and secure asylum, as long as he obeyed the law of the land. The Aliens Act ended that. It created, for the first time in British law, the concept of the undesirable immigrant, a category defined by poverty, criminal record, or medical condition. Immigration officers were empowered to turn away passengers who could not demonstrate financial self-sufficiency. Although the legislation used the word alien rather than Jew, the target was explicit in every parliamentary debate that preceded the vote. The Jewish population of Britain had grown from approximately 60,000 in 1880 to 180,000 by 1905. By the beginning of the 20th century, of approximately 160,000 Jews in Britain outside Ireland, some 83,000 had been born in Russia or Poland. Buried within the Aliens Act, however, was a clause of historic consequence. For the first time, the right of asylum for those fleeing religious or political persecution was formally codified in British law. Jewish enterprise quietly reshapes British industry and culture. The full weight of what Eastern European Jewish immigration contributed to British life did not reveal itself in a single moment or a single generation. It accumulated slowly across decades, in trades and institutions and cultural forms that became so thoroughly integrated into British life that their origins were eventually forgotten. In Leeds, the Jewish community transformed the tailoring industry. Montague Burton, a Lithuanian Jew who fled the Russian pogroms and arrived in Britain in 1900, began selling ready-made suits in Manchester, Leeds and Bradford. By 1913 he owned 5 men's tailoring shops in Sheffield. When the company was floated publicly in 1929, it operated 400 shops and factories across the country. The Leylands district of Leeds, known in the Yiddish press as a continental Jewish ghetto, had a Jewish population of between 12,000 and 14,000 by 1901, rising to 25,000 after 1914. In Manchester, the Strangeways and Cheetham districts developed a similarly concentrated community with its own newspapers, theatres, schools and political organisations. The Yiddish theatre, brought to London in the late 19th century by immigrants from the Pale, established itself in Whitechapel as a serious cultural institution. Jewish free schools, youth movements, and charitable societies were founded across every major city of settlement. The community that had arrived carrying bundles of clothing and tools of their trade had, within a single generation, built an infrastructure of culture, commerce, and civic life that became permanently woven into the fabric of British society.